everybody, thank you for joining us. We're all very pleased to be here. Financial Poise recommends that their moderators start with a joke as an icebreaker. So, not being a comedian, I reached out to ChatGPT for able assistance. My actual prompt was, "Hey, ChatGPT, can you tell me a joke about the state of the life sciences industry?" And ChatGPT let me down on several attempts. I checked with my wife, my daughters, my office mate, my neighbor, my mechanic, my mom. Everybody said, you can't use any of those. So I am putting air quotes around the word joke. ChatGPT was not in a humorous frame of mind. But the good news is that the state of the life sciences industry is not anywhere near as grim as ChatGPT seems to think it is. There have been obvious cuts at NIH and CDC and FDA, cuts to university research. Those are going to have their ripple effects, but university research isn't going anywhere. Life sciences startups aren't going anywhere. Life sciences investment is not going to disappear. The life sciences industry is still robust. And so the better news is that we can have a full discussion today, provide you with an overview of the life sciences industry. And what we're going to cover today is going to be just as relevant and accurate, 3 years from now as it is today. So for those of you who are watching this on replay after the fact, I think you're going to be hearing a lot of the same things. This will be just as relevant for you as it is for those of you who are joining us live today. So thank you for being here. This is Life Sciences Industry Basics. It's episode 1 of the Financial Poise series, Life Sciences and the Law. There are a few administrative details that I should cover first. First, you can read more about Financial Poise generally on slide 46. For those of you who are joining us by video, there is a slide deck, and we'll be scrolling through the slides. We're not going to stick to the slides religiously, but we'll be advancing the slides as we work our way through the discussion. The good news for those of you who aren't on an actual computer or device and can't see the slides, you won't need them. The conversation will be fluid enough for you to be able to follow along. Our panelists are Ed Amer. He's a corporate attorney, a corporate partner at the law firm of Goodwin Procter. Kelly Morgan, who is the general counsel of Ring Therapeutics, and Beth White, who's the chief operating officer of Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator. And again, I'm Jay Riley. I'm a corporate partner at the law firm of Saul Ewing. You can see our names on slide 5. You can read our bios on slides 41 to 44. This isn't an infomercial, so we're not going to tell you anything more about ourselves. You'll be able to check us out on the slides if you want more information about us. We want to thank our co-producer, the National Law Review. I'm going to skip ahead on the slide to slide 3, where you can read more about the National Law Review. It's thanks to them that we're able to be here today to do this for you. And again, you can read more about them on slides 3 and also 45 towards the end of the deck. The last piece of administrative material to cover on slide 4, there's a disclaimer. Very important to know that we are not providing legal advice. You are not our clients. We're not your lawyers. What we're doing here today is for general educational purposes. It's not for you to be able to come away with actionable legal advice. If you need that, we urge you to reach out to your own corporate attorneys and specialists for specific professional advice. So without further ado, here we go. The life sciences industry is broad. There is, if you ask 10 people what you mean when you say the word life sciences, you're going to get 10 different answers. So, Kelly, what are the various different high-level categories that people should be thinking about when they hear the words life sciences?
Yeah, you're exactly right, Jay, in that it is incredibly broad. We're going to highlight just vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and devices as separate sectors of the life sciences industry. And just thinking about these industries, they're exceedingly different with distinct challenges, regulations, and applications. And as it's noted on the slide, these have very different business models, paths to success, and they just all look different. So if we start with vaccines, we're really talking about how a vaccine can elicit a general whole body physical reaction, essentially immunity. And the goal really is to give the vaccines to healthy people and to prevent disease so that these individuals won't get sick in the future. With therapeutics, we're aiming for a targeted physical reaction. So, unlike vaccines, not whole body. And by giving the therapeutic to someone who currently is sick, you're trying to improve that condition that they have. Diagnostics, we're using a test or an assay or a method to try to figure out what the sickness or illness that they have currently is. And with devices, you're talking about a medical intervention that is partially mechanical, or at least not wholly biological or chemical. So I think with each of these industries, their development is different, the risks are different, and the commercialization paths are very different. So, that all, makes it impacts the way that you build and then how and when you fund these companies.
So with all of the differences between these categories of companies, seemingly, several different industries, there are a lot of commonalities between them. There's a reason that people talk about life sciences companies and kind of lump them together as a whole. And what are some of the characteristics that set apart the life sciences industry itself apart from other industries that we talk about?
Yeah, so I think when we look at life science companies, I think some of the characteristics that make it different than typical industrials or consumer products, other companies that we work with, is they tend to be pre-revenue for a long time, and particularly therapeutics companies, vaccines companies. Oftentimes, they will never have revenue, but until we get to an exit or a sale or an IPO. So, as complex as the science can be, in some respects, the companies themselves can be simpler. It can be a company that's formed around a single compound that's being advanced through the clinic to eventually get to a commercialized product. But because the financing needs, and then once you get a commercialized product, the operational challenges change so dramatically that typically, in terms of, our therapeutics company clients, we see them partner or sell before they get to a commercialized product. So I think as folks are, maybe aware of, the drug development process is very expensive. It takes, upwards of a decade typically from identifying a compound to actually getting to a commercialized product. And there are a lot of ways during that process that the drug can fail. And so the investment profile is very binary. The vast majority of therapeutics companies, for example, are just never not going to succeed. They're going to be basically a wash with zero investment. The very few that actually proceed to a commercialized product or a sale will return many multiples of the investment. And so from an investor's perspective, obviously it's very risky to invest in a single company. That's why investors tend to invest in a portfolio of companies so that one or two successes can balance out all of the dry holes, basically. And then I would say it's a heavily regulated industry. Obviously, the drug development process is regulated at every step of the way.
Yeah. It's funny, as we were putting together the slides, we sort of very quickly became aware of just there's such a huge number of skill sets that you need as the CEO of a life sciences company or a senior executive of a life sciences company. Project management, you need to be IP experts, you need to be licensing experts, you need to be, expert in manufacturing and pricing and regulatory, and you got to have mastered the science. You need to know what your partnering strategy is. It's overwhelming. There's so much to know. There's a lot of resources out there. You'll need to avail yourself of those resources. Things like this, this panel right here. But it's an impressive burden. It's a fascinating and rewarding industry to be in, but it's challenging to be in this industry. Just ready. Kelly and Ed, you've touched on so many things that are just so diverse that are really need to be second nature and are second nature to people in this industry. Well, let's move on to sort of the overall life cycle of biotech and device companies. Beth, we'd asked you to sort of think about a bit of a case study to tell us about. Can you talk about the mRNA vaccine, the COVID vaccine development story?
Yeah, and we thought we'd use this as an example because a lot of people are familiar with it. Everybody went through the whole COVID pandemic and think pretty aware of what was happening with the COVID vaccines. So it's an interesting example because it, walks you through all the different phases of development and what companies go through. However, it's actually quite an unusual example because it went way faster than most things go. So I want to point that out. Now, the foundation of the vaccine development is based on mRNA or messenger RNA technology, and that technology has been developed for many, many years by academic universities, by companies like Moderna and BioNTech. And so when the pandemic hit, they were able to take advantage of actually already understanding the technology and actually innovating to apply that technology to what was needed for the COVID vaccines to develop them quickly. So that was kind of an unusual thing, and we really set it up. But, a lot of science develops that way and eventually comes to something that can be translated into actual use. So, when COVID hit, the Chinese scientists published a genetic sequence of the coronavirus in January of 2020. And you can see on the slide, really what the rapid development was. Moderna, I'll show you the Moderna example, and they collaborated with the NIH, designed a vaccine candidate, and they actually got things started very quickly. They were in their first phase 1 trial, which is sort of the first safety trial. I'll talk a little bit more later about the phases of clinical development. They dosed their first patient in March of 2020. By May, they were in their second phase of trials where they expand the population. And then the government got involved with Operation Warp Speed, and that helped with funding and logistical support. And then they got into a 30,000 patient participant phase 3 trial in July. And they announced the results by November. So those were the steps they went through, and they actually got an emergency use authorization, which is an early kind of authorization that the FDA was allowing in this sort of emergency case. Within 1 year, we went from, starting the trials to actually getting products on the market. And then the BioNTech Pfizer situation was very similar as well. So it was an interesting example, but just to reiterate that usually those things take a lot longer, and the regulatory process doesn't keep up quite as fast as they did, but it can happen. Yeah.
Actually, you just touched on something I was going to follow up with, Beth. What does that typical pathway look like in terms of timing? How long does it take to find the basic science, to come up with a formulation, to do those preclinicals? What's the usual? I
think Ed mentioned earlier, closer to 10 years when you think about, and a lot of that is actually starting with the translational part of it. Again, even after, you do the original basic science that leads you to something like this. But it's a very long, very expensive process.
Yeah. Let's get back to the basics, the technology. These companies are built on, patents when it really comes right down to it, patents, know-how and data. Where did these innovations come from? Beth, you alluded to this in Moderna. There are some platform technologies, then there were some innovations that sat on top of that. Kelly, can you talk about this a little bit more explicitly? How do these technologies get developed, and how do they make their way into biotechs?
Yeah, companies, they're essentially, both you and Beth have hit on this, is that they're essentially built on innovations, and the innovation that can seed companies can come by way of universities, academic institutions, other startups, pharma. Occasionally, they can come directly from sole inventors. So they can come from a lot of different places. And, if these seed inventions are externally derived, they usually come by way of an in-license into the company. So, or, an acquisition, they can be purchased or acquired by whoever originally had them. And in some rare cases, they can be homegrown by the company. The inventors are the employees of the company. And so then the company owns them outright. But the most common avenue is probably some sort of license from an academic institution. I think that's where a lot of academics are great invention, invention powerhouses. And so, having the invention come directly from an academic institution, you can utilize multiple different avenues to do that. You can have a sponsored research agreement, some sort of an exclusive license to that research that's coming out of a particular lab or labs. You can consult with somebody that's, a key opinion leader in the field. And research agreements, manufacturing agreements directly with cores that are housed within a university. So there's multiple different ways that a company can leverage getting access to the rights that they need.
So that's interesting. So who actually is building these companies? We talk about, technology finding their ways into the companies. How are these companies actually being built? How are they being put together? In preparing for this, Ed, you'd mentioned that the model is actually changing somewhat. Can you talk a little bit about that traditional model of who's building these biotechs and how that is evolving?
Sure. I would say when I started my career roughly 20 years ago, the typical model we would see is you would have some scientists, often working in academia, develop some technology that was promising and they wanted to build a company around. So they would negotiate with their university tech transfer office to spin out the technology into a new company. They would, build it, basically take that new company and then knock on the doors of a bunch of venture capital investors and negotiate how much of the company the venture capital investors would own based on a specific investment, and that's evolved. I think at some point the venture capital investors realized that they themselves could seed a lot of these companies, and basically they could decide there's a specific indication or technology that they wanted to build a company around, that they wanted to focus on, and they would go out and basically find technology to in-license some sort of partner to then basically build a company, build a seed company themselves. And some of the venture capital funds that have kind of risen to prominence in the industry have just, dozens and dozens and dozens of these companies, because as mentioned earlier, they are very hit and miss. And so there's an emphasis on doing things very as efficiently as possible and getting to a failure as efficiently as possible, so that you can basically, wind down companies and stop the clinical development, stop the costs involved in that as early as possible, and before you've spent a lot of time negotiating bespoke financing documents with the founders and entering into leases and other commercial contracts. A lot of the venture funds now perform a lot of the initial development services internally, or they outsource it to clinical research organizations or CROs and contract development and manufacturing organizations, CDMOs. So I think, maybe one of the points that I didn't touch on in the earlier slide is that a lot of these companies are very simple. It's basically the technology, the IP in a corporate shell, and more or less nothing else. All of the development services are provided on an outsourced basis, either by the fund to the extent they have operational resources, or by third-party vendors.
Interesting. So, in terms of actually building the companies, who's doing the work, who's involved, how big is the team, how many employees am I hiring, what exactly do I need? Is me a new CEO, new startup company, I've got this technology, I'm thinking about, do I do this in-house? Do I use a third-party vendor? What do I do in-house? What do I use a vendor for? Let me just throw this out to all of you. What role, how important is it to know where you're going, to know how you're going to get there? Can you kind of figure it out as you go, or do you really kind of need to have a bit of a longer term strategy as you're getting started?
Well, maybe I'll start today. And one of the important things to think about is, what is your exit strategy? And by that, I mean, what do you intend to do at the end? Do you tend to sell the company? Do you tend to take it commercial? And, depending on that strategy, and I think it's a good way to think about what your exit strategy might be in terms of different milestones you could hit. So you might be planning to build a discovery platform that you would license out to various partners, and you kind of continue to churn through some different things that you might license. Or perhaps you might intend to exit once you take a program through the first stages of clinical development, and then let another company, a bigger company perhaps, take it on for the bigger registrational phase 3 type trial. Or maybe take it through that trial yourself, which is, a whole nother level of clinical and regulatory capabilities, or take it all the way through commercialization. Some startup companies think, I want to, develop this program and I want to actually be the one to market it. And again, that's a whole nother realm, right? So I think how you build the organization's capabilities really kind of depends on what you're thinking in terms of that, because, do you build a lot of discovery research, scientific capabilities, you build out a laboratory, or you're going to go all the way through clinical development or commercialization, where you need, a lot more different kinds of talent and skill sets that you're going to eventually get to. So it's a good way to think about that. And it is important to think about that early on as you're doing your fundraise, because, one of the first questions investors will ask is, what is that exit strategy? How are you planning to fund that? So you know what you're asking for from investors to do that company build.
Yeah. If the exit is a sale, Ed, what are acquirers looking for, and what would turn off an acquirer? What, what can entrepreneurs do when they're starting out to make their companies as attractive as possible to acquirers?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just to sort of amplify Beth's point, I think at the outset, it's important to have an idea of what you want that exit to be. If there is an exit, maybe you want to just build out a company that's going to be the next Genentech or the next Pfizer, and really be one of the short list of biopharma companies that are publicly traded. But I would say a lot of the industry, a lot of the pre-commercial industry operates as outsourced pharma R&D, because big pharmaceutical companies notoriously are not great at their own internal R&D efforts. And so over time, more and more, they've effectively outsourced it to, individual companies and into the venture firms that form part of the overall ecosystem. And I think folks realize that when they built companies that had leases and employees and a bunch of operations, and then they sold them to pharma based on the strength of an individual drug, then pharma would basically strip out all of they would say, okay, we don't want the lease, we don't want the employees, we just want the IP. And so one of the models that sort of, I think, accelerated the push towards venture capital firms acting as, what some folks call venture studios, where they're just creating a bunch of product specific companies with minimal operations, is then when you're selling them to pharma, you're basically, if you've outsourced all of the development work, and if you have sort of contract management teams providing services to multiple companies, and maybe they're all just renting shared lab space, which a lot of these shared lab space facilities have become very common in many geographies throughout the country and world. Then once you're exiting to a pharma, you're basically selling a company, a corporate shell with just that individual program in it, which is exactly what pharma wants. They don't want all the extra stuff, all the operational stuff, and employee history and tax history, et cetera.
What's the panel's thoughts? What are all of your thoughts on the benefits of bringing a strategic partner to the table early, right? Maybe as an investor, maybe as a collaborator. Is that good? Is it dangerous? Does it give you support early on? Does it focus you? Does it eliminate strategic alternatives down the road? What's your thought on getting them into a bear hug sooner?
I think one of the things that really depends on what that partner looks like, and how early or how extensive that relationship is, depends on the technology. Because if you're talking about a platform technology and you're bringing in a strategic partner, are they partnering on the entire platform, and so they have a little bit of say in the entire thing? Or are they, really just a strategic partner on a therapeutic or an indication or, a subset of the platform if you are a platform company? If you're like Ed had alluded to, a company with, a single asset, a single commercial product, then bringing that partner in earlier is probably more advantageous because you have that relationship early on.
Yeah, I think generally, if the plan is that eventually you want to work with a strategic partner or sell the company to a big pharma, it's a good idea to engage early, but you have to do it intentionally and do it well. First of all, I would only reach out to strategic partners who are interested in what you're doing. A lot of them really, sort of publicize what their strategic areas are and what they want to work on. And so if you can make the case that you fit within their strategic priorities, then that makes a lot of sense. And if you connect with them early and sort of collaborate along the way, it becomes, number one, they get input into what direction you're going and give you some good advice so that the program gets developed in a way that is more attractive to them. But you should do it carefully in that, you shouldn't go too early. I think a lot of scientific founders, for example, think, oh, well, this big company is going to be interested in what I'm doing. So I want to reach out now, but they're not really prepared. They don't have enough data. And it's okay if you don't have all the data when you reach out, but you need to have a plan on how you would get there, and it needs to make sense to them. And so, I would just do it in a very proactive and measured way. But to me, it's always a good idea if it makes sense to, build those relationships over the years.
And I would say one thing that the strategics have done to facilitate that is, again, sort of going back 15, 20 years, you used to see strategics when they were involved investing in a company, they would try to extract contractual rights, options to buy, the company or the lead programs, which could really, I think, from the other investors, the rest of the investor syndicate's perspective, could jeopardize their ability to maximize the return. And I think strategics have, because they were often sort of walled off from good opportunities, over time they've realized that they, if they just forego any rights, invest with no strings attached, at least they have a view of what's going on. They have a seat at the table. They can follow, again, as Beth said, they can follow the development from early on in the development timeline. And, they've sort of understood that they're not going to be able to sort of get a discount if a program is, if they have sort of some sort of strategic contractual rights with respect to a company. But instead, they've realized that at least if they're sitting at the table, they'll have visibility and they'll have the opportunity to make the best offer.
Mhm.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Let's move on to financing. Let's talk a little bit about actually getting money into these startups. We've for those of you following along at home, we're on slide 18. Just kind of have a general list of funding sources. Beth, do you want to talk a little bit about non-dilutive funding? What do we mean by the term non-dilutive funding, and where does it come from? Where does it appear from?
Yeah, really the sort of top two bullets there are more related to non-dilutive funding. And a lot of that could be government grants. So that might be NIH, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, and other things. And a lot of times those are used to fund university research. And that's very important in the early days. And as companies are getting started, they often kind of rely on that. Of course, those are donations, those are grants. They don't take any equity. And once a company is formed, you can go with things like SBIR or STTR grants. So SBI is Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR is Small Business Technology Transfer Program. So those are like, they call it America's Seed Funding. Those are government programs that help small companies get started. And a lot of times people will try to get that kind of money. There's a relatively new one, actually not listed on the slide. It's called ARPA-H, which stands for the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. It's similar to DARPA, if you've ever heard of that, which is related to the Department of Defense and has, provided a lot of grant money for, programs that they see could be interesting to what they're doing. ARPA-H has only been around for a few years. Hopefully it's going to survive through all the things that are going on right now. And they're really supporting very transformative biomedical and health breakthroughs and trying to come up with really innovative projects. And they do it in a little bit of a different way, where they do it more as a contract with milestones, where they say they're going to award a certain amount of money, but you have to hit each milestone to get the money. So that's a really nice non-dilutive way. And then there are other non-government organizations like nonprofits and patient advocacy groups and venture philanthropy and foundations like, Chan Zuckerberg and other foundations that if you can get that money, it can be great. But generally speaking, in non-dilutive, I would say it's great to get that because it doesn't dilute your company at all. But a lot of those things are a little bit slower and lower dollars than you might get from other types of investors. And a lot of, especially the government ones, have a lot of reporting requirements, which take, a lot of your time. You don't want to depend too much on that. It's nice to get companies started that way. And of course, with the government funding right now, there's some uncertainty, but hopefully that'll all settle down soon. Yeah.
Great. And just to sort of level the playing field, when we say the word non-dilutive, usually when you're raising money in a company and you sell stock, you're diluting your ownership interest. So in exchange for bringing in money, you're issuing shares. The idea is that you've got a smaller piece of a pie that's growing bigger and bigger. So overall, the value of what you're holding is increasing. But in terms of percentages, you're getting diluted down every time you sell stock. So when we all use the phrase non-dilutive, it's basically a gift. These grants, sometimes you need to pay for some of the intellectual property rights that come out of them, but often you don't, or often it's a nominal value. So it's a good way of getting value and research into the company, resources into the company, without having to dilute yourself in terms of your equity ownership. So non-dilutive. And how about early stage funding? If a company is outgrown its SBIRs, ARPA-H, great point, Beth. That's a fun one. DoD. What are some of the first types of funding that would be dilutive, that or other types of funding that might not be dilutive that a startup can turn to?
Yeah, and so I'll sort of try to keep it relatively brief because I think we have a subsequent episode on financing. But generally, if it's a priced equity round where there's going to be actual stock issued, that tends to be preferred stock, where the investor has basically, if they invest $5 million, they are entitled to the first $5 million of proceeds, and that also gets them. That sort of protects them in a downside scenario, and then that also basically gets them a percentage of the company, which depends on what the pre-money value is. And so to to just put rough numbers on it, let's say I have a company and I negotiate with the investors that it's worth 10 million before they invest. They put in 5 million, they're going to own a third of the company. So if we sell it for 300 million, they get 100 million, I get 200 million. So that's how, typical preferred stock investment would work. Oftentimes, and what we see in early stage financings is because either the pre-money, the investors and the company can't agree on what the pre-money is. Maybe it's so early, it's so speculative, because you're effectively trying to project commercial revenues that might or might not be there a decade or more down the road, and then discount them to present value and adjust them for risk. Instead, what we often see is just convertible debt or SAFE financings, and SAFE stands for the simple agreement for future equity. They are effectively the same thing, subject, with some tax nuances that are different. But what that effectively means is it's just debt until you actually do a priced financing round. So you could take $1 million in SAFE financing, and it will just say this $1 million will convert into, it'll basically buy you $1 million worth of preferred stock if and when the company actually does a preferred stock financing, which might be a year later, or longer. And typically, because the SAFE or convertible debt investor is investing early, there are sweeteners, there are discounts. Maybe there's a conversion cap. So if the company is able to get an investment round for $50 million, because the investors are willing to pay an exorbitant based on an exorbitant pre-money value, the note holder is capped at a lower conversion price, so they get a better deal.
So you touched on a lot there, and we are doing another session. Tune in. We've got a schedule in the deck, but this is an important topic, and it's one that gets a lot of people interested. So let's spend a little bit more time on it. Ed, you mentioned a couple of concepts. One is you gave a great mathematical example. If my pre-money valuation is 10 million, I put in 5 million. I will have put in 5 million out of something that after the fact is worth 15 million. So I'll get a third of the company. That's straight old Shark Tank math, right? I'm going to give you $1 million for 25% of the company. End quote, Mark Cuban. But Kelly, do you want to talk how much should I be? So there's two variables there, right? One is how much am I raising, and the other one is what's my pre-money valuation. Kelly, do you want to talk a little bit about the strategy in figuring out how much you want to be asking for?
I think that really depends on what your research outlook looks like. Because I think a lot of times, depending on what your next inflection point is for when you believe, and some key data will come out, or some partnership that you have might be in the works of being executed. I think a lot of those can depend and influence how much you negotiate in a financing round. And I think a lot of times too, it depends on what your investors are willing to give, what your research looks like today and what their expectations are for, what it's going to get you, what it's going to take you to get to the next point. So, I think in today's market, you're really almost at the mercy of investors, a lot of companies, especially biotechs, because you need as much as you need. And if the investors really aren't willing to give you that, then you have to keep looking for other ways, just like Beth had mentioned, other opportunities, what else is out there to be able to fund the research.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, definitely. Sorry, cut you off. Go ahead and jump in.
No, I was going to say, I think what we want to avoid, or investors want to avoid, is sort of a bridge to nowhere, where maybe the company is doing preclinical development, they put in 5 million and they progress and do more testing, but they don't have any results, any data that will allow them to go and raise money at a higher valuation. So typically, I think we see companies try to measure their financing round size based on what's going to get them to the next value inflection point. So if I take in 5 million, that allows me to get through the preclinical phase and file an IND. At that point, maybe instead of, if I had been raising money at a $10 million valuation, maybe that's a significant inflection point that now I can go raise money at a $25 million valuation. And so another, 10 million is less dilution than taking 5 million at a $10 million pre-money valuation.
Yeah. Panelists, any tips on what you can do to negotiate your pre-money valuation? How is that determined? How do investors decide what your pre-money valuation is? How can you dress up your company to make it look better? What are some of the arguments you can bear?
Well, in addition to what's already been said, one of the interesting things that I've seen many times throughout my career with startup companies is, you're trying to make the case of what value it's going to bring in the end, right, in the marketplace, and forecasting what, this particular drug is going to be worth and so forth. But a lot of startup companies in that early stage where you're trying to figure out what the value and make that story, Jay, they just sort of say, wow, this is a $1 billion market. Look at what is going on out there, so I'm going to have a $1 billion market, without really thinking about your particular program, where it fits in, how it's differentiated from the other competition, what the unmet needs are, what's special about your particular innovation in science, and really make a well thought out story about it. Really what the value of this particular program could be that is going to be a portion of that overall market. And if you can, convince people that you've actually thought through that and how you would get to that, I think you make a much stronger case.
I think one also, just a cautionary piece is that, we saw that during, 2021, 2020, early 2022, the market was booming in biotech. And a lot of companies had valuations that, were raising money off of, much, much smaller data packages than what had normally been the case or normally been required to raise that type of money. And so their valuations went through the roof. And now we're in an economy where valuations are really, hard to justify what those initial, raises created valuations at in those booming days. And so I think it's a little bit of a cautionary, tale that you want to make sure that your valuation is grounded in fact and not just in, the circumstances that, you're sitting in immediately right now, but, thinking about what you want to do in the future as well.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, let's move on. But I could talk about financing all day. So let's move on to slide 19. We've talked about getting technology into these companies. We've talked about how the companies coalesce and how they get formed. We've talked about how they get financed. I want to spend a minute just talking about actually making the product, right? We've got the technology, we've got the money. Let's spend a minute about making the product. And then we'll move on to talk about what Ed pointed out, the regulatory underpinnings, right? That's what, guides and shapes the development of how these companies grow. In terms of manufacturing drugs versus devices, obviously it's a very different pathway, right? Manufacturing devices, you've got engineering. It's a pretty straightforward process just because it's a very tactile process. It's something that we understand. I think the thing to point out about devices is it's not just about building something on the benchtop. It often involves a combination of electronics and technology and basic engineering and software and open source and programming and user interface. There's a lot of design considerations that go into medical devices. That's just fascinating, but really it's a very different design process from designing a drug. Drugs are fascinating, not so much in the design. That usually is a little bit more straightforward. It starts out on the benchtop. You start with a compound. Once you've identified a compound and you've tested it in vivo and in vitro, in cells, perhaps in animals, you optimize what you're using. You optimize the structure. Those drugs need to be stabilized. Sometimes you add things called adjuvants, which provide them with additional biological activity. You often need to think about the delivery of those drugs. So sometimes you'll be delivering it in a bit of a freeze-dried form, something that's called lyophilization. But once you've got all that figured out, and I don't mean to minimize it, it's a lot, you're then putting it into some small scale clinical trials, and you need to manufacture it at a clinical trial scale. But eventually, if this is successful, as you're moving into larger clinical trials, and especially if you start moving into commercialization, you've got to be able to manufacture that drug at scale. So, with an engineering of a device, it's a pretty straightforward process to scale that up. You've got an assembly line, you've got programmers, you've got some engineering. But scaling up a drug product is like going from baking a cake the size of a cupcake to a cake the size of a Volkswagen Beetle or bigger. And it's just different. You can't stick it in the oven at 350 and bake it for 28 minutes and have it come out if it weighs 3,000 pounds. So there is a lot to be taken into consideration in scaling up compounds as you're rolling through the development process. So the main takeaway about manufacturing is that manufacturing is something that accompanies the growth of these products. There are different manufacturing tasks that need to happen at different times. Increasing levels of sophistication need to be introduced into the manufacturing process at different points in time. Eventually, at the end of the day, you're going to have very detailed protocols describing exactly what your raw materials are. And those raw materials need to be qualified and validated. You need protocols to talk about how they're going to be combined, what pH, what volumes, what temperatures, for how long, what rate of agitation does the mix get. So you've got assays to check and make sure that the process is working the way that it's supposed to work. You've got release testing to make sure that what actually came out at the end of the day is what you'd expected. So there's a lot to consider in terms of pharmaceutical scale up of manufacturing these drugs. And a lot of times that scale up involves the creation of additional IP. There can be patents covering this process. There can be trade secrets covering this process. So the takeaway here is that this can be costly, it can be timely, it can be a gating item. The CEOs of startup companies need to be thinking just as much about the practicalities of manufacturing as with the regulatory pathway, the scientific pathway, in figuring all of that out. So let's move on to slide 20. We've really touched on collaborations and exits quite a bit, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide. But as we were putting this together, Ed, you and I had a bit of a conversation about the role of tax planning and thinking about these exits. So there's the strategic planning of what you think your exit's going to look like, but there's also a role in terms of tax planning. What should people be thinking about when they're starting these companies from that perspective?
Yeah, so ideally, you're going to want to sell stock in a company rather than selling assets out of the company. Because if you have a company formed as a corporation and they sell assets, then the payments go into the corporation. They're taxed at the corporate level. Then when you distribute them out to investors, they're taxed again. And so that's been one of the challenges in the life science industry is when you have companies that have multiple potential exits. Let's say you have an IP platform that generates multiple compounds that proceed through clinical development, and you want to sell those to different buyers. Those buyers are necessarily going to have to buy assets out of the corporation, which is tax inefficient. And so there are structures that have evolved where you have sort of a parent company that's not taxed as a corporation, it's taxed as a pass-through entity, and you have multiple program-specific corporate subs. And so that's, I think that's probably for a more advanced tax structuring class, but I think those are some of the considerations, the tax considerations. It's always going to be better to sell stock and get capital gains rather than sell assets and pay two levels of tax and ordinary income at the corporate level.
Interesting. So I think the main takeaway from this side is, holy smokes, talk to your tax attorney early and often.
Yes.
So there's actually a lot to talk about on collaborations and exits, but I want to move on a little bit more. Like I said, we did already talk about it to some extent. I want to talk about regulatory development, and I'm going to come back to commercialization. I got these slides a little bit out of order. In terms of clinical trials, I'm going to focus mainly on drugs and therapeutics, because the developmental path, the evolution of these life sciences companies really centers on the regulatory development. Your ability to raise money depends on the clinical results. So Beth, let me turn it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about just what the regulatory path of these companies is, and what some of the considerations are, what we mean by clinical trials. Yeah, if you could just talk us through a little bit of what regulatory is for these companies and how it affects their development.
Yeah, sure. And you had that smallpox slide up there, Jim. I think that's just an example of, this is from way back when somebody first tried to figure out how do you test something in human beings. And I'm sure it wasn't very ethical what happened here, but, it was a start. But that was very uncontrolled and, started to give people a sense of how you might do this sort of thing. Now, things are very controlled, highly regulated by the FDA and other regulatory authorities around the world, which don't necessarily always agree exactly how things should be done. But generally speaking, and in the US, what a company has to do first is file what's called an IND, which is an investigation of new drug application. And that gives you permission from the FDA to actually take your drug and put it into human clinical trials. And there's a whole bunch of work that gets done to file that IND, a whole bunch of preclinical work in the laboratory and in animal studies and toxicology studies looking for safety and figuring out what dose you should even try in humans and to justify that. So there's a lot that gets done to get an IND and get an IND approved and then say, okay, now you can start clinical trials. And then those clinical trials are what we call, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. And generally speaking, and there's a lot beyond this, in different circumstances, but generally speaking, there's a small phase 1 trial that's mostly looking for safety, often done in healthy people, healthy human volunteers, where you're trying to figure out how the drug is sort of working in the human body and is it safe. And usually start with a small dose and then you increase the dose to see if that continues to be safe. And then once you learn more from that, you go to phase 2, which is a bigger trial and is more focused on actually seeing how the drug works, the efficacy. So you're looking at a larger population and trying to learn a lot more about it, trying to develop what are the right clinical endpoints to even study for this drug and for this particular disease that you're trying to treat. And those trials get more sophisticated. And you can see also at the bottom of these, they talk about the success rate or each stage. So as you go through each stage of this clinical development, the success rate gets lower. And the whole game is to try to do what you can do in the early, smaller, less expensive trials to set you up for success in the later, more expensive trials. Then you get to phase 3, which is really, the what they call registrational trial, the one that is going to provide the data that is going to convince the regulatory agencies that you ought to be able to register this drug for marketing approval. And so generally you're in a much larger population, and really having to show statistical significance, usually in a trial that's really well controlled, maybe versus a placebo where some patients are not being treated, to really prove the drug. And that's what goes into your new drug application or biologics license application in the case of biologics and advanced therapies, to get the FDA to approve it. And there's a couple other slides in here also about other pathways. There are many circumstances that don't fit very well. We're learning more and more, especially, for diseases that are much more rare, that paradigm of drug development really doesn't fit very well because you can't do these kind of large trials and really well-controlled trials. And some of the patients are children. And so the FDA has pushed more towards different kinds of regulatory flexibility, different ways to expedite programs, some clinical trial flexibility, some financial incentives that have actually helped, because a lot of times companies are not that interested in investing in smaller kind of opportunities for small populations. And then I think one more slide, Jay. There are other, programs that are being put together to try to help move these things along and provide these incentives. So there's a lot there to learn about the regulatory process, but that's just a little bit of a high-level overview.
One thing that's implied, that's sort of drifted to the surface a number of times over this, is as you progress through the clinic, which basically means as you have a successful phase 1, as you have a successful phase 2, those are very important inflection points in terms of the value of a company. The value of a company will jump as it gets to each of those inflection points. It's a great proof of concept. The program gets de-risked the further along you can make it. So as you're talking to investors, the value goes up if you're able to show a successful phase 1, even more if you're able to show a successful phase 2. And the value for the exit goes up. When you're talking to a strategic partner, the further you've been able to take it, the more you've been able to de-risk it, the more you're likely to be able to get for the asset. Well, we're running a little bit short of time, and I did want to talk a little bit about intellectual property. So I'm going to gloss over the medical device regulatory pathway. They're not quite, there's absolute value to medical devices as they work their way through some very different processes with FDA. We'll cover that more in depth on June 10th at our session on regulatory. But it's a very different process. It's more straightforward in a number of ways. Let's move on to talk just a little bit more about IP protection, because at the end of the day, what is really protecting you is a combination of intellectual property and to some extent regulatory exclusivity. Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about patents and the benefits and drawbacks of patents?
Yeah, definitely. I think, exclusivity is one of the obvious benefits of why you get patent protection. And that goes with the right to protect your invention for 20 years from filing. I think the point that we made earlier is that the typical process of therapeutic development could be up to a decade or more to get to your commercial product. And so your patent life is just ticking away during that time. So a lot of that exclusivity that you glean from having a patent is just lost during the development of your product. And so, having those, like the rare disease, orphan drug exclusivities can be beneficial to augment, your patent protection. I think, patents themselves are very costly. And, really you need to safeguard your confidentiality in a lot of ways. And when you actually file a patent application, you publish that invention. And so part of the give and take of the exclusivity is to actually put those, that knowledge out into the public space. And so, there are pros and cons to that. And, I think we'll touch on trade secrets a little bit, but, trade secrets are, that really is only protected by keeping it confidential.
But, why don't you talk a little bit about trade secrets? Because that's an interesting, what's the alternative to the patent and putting this into the public domain?
So trade secrets are, it really is. It's something that you just keep secret within the company. I think one of the biggest cons to trade secrets is if you've lost it, you've lost it. Your protection is gone. And, so you have to have complete and wholesale buy-in from the company in order to protect your trade secret. And really the best way to do that is to keep your trade secret under lock and key with just a small number of individuals, because so much of the time it's inadvertent escape of the trade secret, and you can't pull that back. So I think trade secrets are great when you can actually lock them down and keep them secret, because then you have an indefinite time to actually, maintain that trade secret or to keep that. But the flip side of that is it's very hard to do that. People are people. We talk, scientists talk. And so it's very hard to actually enforce the secret part of that.
Yeah. One thing that I would add is, trade secrets are protected by statute, both federal and state statutes. They're not just confidential information. It's not enough to just keep your secret. These statutes have some requirements that you need to jump through, some hoops that you need to jump through to officially elevate confidential information from just being confidential to this plateau of being a trade secret. So, you'll want to confer with your patent attorneys, your IP attorneys, to really, identify that confidential information that's worthy of being elevated and understand what some of those protections are that you need to put in place.
Yes. And that's why I really, touch on the fact that you need buy-in from the leadership, from the company as a whole in order to do that, because it really is not just protection as a confidential thing. It's a lot more layers, a lot more processes and protocols and procedures that have to be put in place in the company.
Yeah. Well, everybody, thank you so much for just a really engaging discussion. I apologize. We need to end here. We've reached the end of our time. We didn't quite hit all of the points that were raised on all of our slides. For those of you listening in, you may want to log into Financial Poise and review the deck. There's more good information here. But again, I want to say thank you so much to Ed Amer of Goodwin, Kelly Morgan, the General Counsel of Ring Therapeutics, and Beth White, the Chief Operating Officer of Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator. Guys, thank you so much for joining the discussion today and leading just a really great panel. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. Really appreciate your attendance. I hope you can join us again on June 10th for our next session, which will be entitled Life Sciences Regulatory Overview. So thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.